You know, words have an incredible amount of power. They literally shape how we see the world, how we think, but what happens when a single, really important word gets translated in a way that might, well, shift its original meaning entirely? Today, we're going to dig into one of the most foundational words in all of Christianity, and it all kicks off by asking one simple but pretty challenging question.
So let me just throw this out there. What if that word we all know, church, isn't actually in the original Greek manuscripts of the New Testament? I know, it's a provocative idea, but it's the absolute key to understanding a debate that's been quietly simmering for centuries.
Okay, this slide right here gets to the very heart of the issue. On one side, you have the original Greek word ekklesia. Our source material defines it simply as a gathered assembly. But on the other side, you've got church, a word that, let's be honest, for most of us brings to mind buildings, institutions, and formal structures. So the big question is, how in the world did we get from one to the other?
All right, so let's start by just poking at an assumption many of us have probably held our entire lives, about a word we feel like we know inside and out.
According to our source, this whole conversation really hinges on an assumption we don't even think about. We've just been taught to see church and ekklesia as perfect synonyms, but the argument we're exploring is that they're not the same at all, and that this little difference has some massive implications.
So, to really get to the bottom of this, we have to do a little detective work and go back to the original Greek. What did ekklesia actually mean to the people who were first writing and hearing it?
Well, the definition is surprisingly simple. Ekklesia means a called-out assembly. The key here is the emphasis on a physical, embodied gathering of people. It's not some abstract concept or a worldwide organization or a building. It's the actual people together in one place.
And you can see this in action right in the scripture. Here in 1 Corinthians, the phrase, when you come together as an ekklesia, directly links the word to the act of physically getting together. It's something you do. Now, this example from the book of Acts is just fascinating because it's not even in a religious context. It's describing a chaotic public town meeting in Ephesus that gets dismissed by a city official. And the Greek word used for that rowdy gathering, you guessed it, ekklesia. This is a huge clue that its core meaning was simply assembly, way before it had any theological weight attached to it.
So, if the meaning is that clear, where did all the confusion come from? Well, our next clue uncovers something of a lost linguistic bridge, one that connects the New Testament all the way back to the Old Testament.
The key, our source argues, is found in the Septuagint. Now, what's that? It was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, and it was basically the version of the scriptures that the apostles and the New Testament writers knew by heart and quoted all the time. It is a vital piece of this puzzle.
This timeline just lays it out so clearly. See, in the original Hebrew, the word for the assembly of Israel was kahal. So, when scholars translated that into Greek for the Septuagint, they chose the word ekklesia to mean kahal. This means when the New Testament writers used ekklesia, they weren't inventing some new special term. They were intentionally using the established scriptural word for the assembly of God's people.
And get this, the New Testament even makes this connection totally explicit. Here in Acts, Stephen is talking about Moses and the Israelites at Mount Sinai, and he calls them the ekklesia in the wilderness. It really couldn't be any clearer. The assembly of Israel in the Old Testament and the assembly of believers in the New are described with the exact same word.
And here's the real consequence. When English translators decided to use the word church, that obvious, visible link was just broken. For anyone reading in English, the congregation of Israel and the church of the New Testament suddenly looked like two completely different things, even though the original Greek used the very same word for both.
Okay, so this brings us right to the historical turning point. How did this shift in translation and meaning actually happen? Let's trace the journey of this word from a simple gathering to a complex institution.
This timeline really shows the evolution. It all starts in the 1st century with these simple assemblies. Then, over the next few centuries, more formal structures and hierarchies start to develop. Fast forward to the Reformation, and you've got a translator named William Tyndale who tries to bring back the original meaning with the word congregation. But then, less than 100 years later, the King James Version is specifically told to use the word church.
And this reveals that it was a deliberate, almost political choice. See, Tyndale's translation wasn't just about language. It was a theological bombshell that challenged the power of the institution by focusing on the gathering of people. The King James Mandate, on the other hand, was designed to protect that institutional authority by keeping the familiar word church. This was a decision that had huge consequences. So we've waded through the history and the linguistics, but what's the big deal? Why does this distinction between assembly and church actually matter to you and me today? Let's break down the practical implications.
I mean, you can see the very practical differences right here. If your starting point is assembly, then authority and accountability are relational. They happen among people who are physically together, who actually know each other. But if your starting point is church as an institution, authority can become hierarchical, maybe even detached based on a title, and accountability can become more of an abstract idea than a lived reality. Your whole identity can shift from being part of a gathered people to being a member of an organization.
And Scripture seems to back this idea up. I mean, think about it. Key concepts like leadership and submission are consistently described in terms of physical proximity. Elders are told to shepherd the flock, that is, among them. Oversight is meant to happen by visible example, not by some distant decree. Honestly, these commands really only make sense in the context of a real, tangible, gathered assembly where people are in actual, accountable relationships.
You know, as our source material wraps up, the goal here isn't to create division or to attack tradition for the sake of it. The appeal is just for clarity, to let the language of the Bible speak for itself without all the layers of historical and institutional meaning that have been piled on top over the centuries. And that leaves us with this final, really powerful question to chew on. The source suggests that before we get into debates about what a true church is, we first have to ask if we've even got the foundation right. Does that simple, physically gathered assembly, the ekklesia of the New Testament, even exist in our modern way of doing things? Now that is a question worth pondering.